The ICG is a community of independent market researchers who collaborate, share knowledge and experience to deliver value to fellow members and to clients. If you're an independent researcher and want to connect with over 400 like-minded people, gain access to our knowledge base, get inspiration, support and advice from other members, then why don't you join us? Either visit our website, theicg.co.uk/join, or email us at membership@theicg.co.uk. If you're a client company and want to connect with the largest resource of expert independent researchers in the world, with proven expertise across all markets, categories and techniques, then why don't you contact us? Either visit our website, theicg.co.uk/connect, or email us, connect@theicg.co.uk. If you're a supplier and want to promote yourself to over 400 buyers of research services, then why don't you contact us? Either visit our website, theicg.co.uk/advertise, or email us at admin@theicg.co.uk. The ICG, Expert Independent Researchers. Welcome to So What Research. We are a relaxed and flexible viewing facility, and we pride ourselves on our warm welcome and our fantastic team, with everything in place to ensure a smooth running, creative and of course fun evening. Our studios have bright, clean and airy decor, with the benefit of plenty of natural light, and each studio can easily be adapted to your needs. Our studios also provide ideal meeting spaces, catering for large and small meetings, with additional breakout spaces and catering available on request. We're located opposite Richmond Tube and train station, giving excellent transport links. We're best for respondents with easy access by car and public transport, meaning everyone arrives happy and on time. We are best for clients with 16 direct trains from Waterloo to Richmond every hour, being only 30 minutes from central London and yet feeling a world away from the artificial feel of inner London research groups. We are best for researchers and recruiters with access to the widest range of demographics from all over central and southwest London and Surrey. So What Research is proud to support the work of the ICG and independent researchers, and we think that our venue is best for you. And we're so sure that we would like to offer ICG members 25% off studio costs on your next direct booking and 10% off all subsequent bookings.
All right, thank you, Arthur, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. As Arthur says, today Samantha and I will be providing a whistle-stop tour of behavioural economics, trying to cover this expanding and exciting discipline. In an hour, that's a bit of a challenge, but we're going to try and rattle through it. And hopefully by the end, you'll have an understanding of this area, a new perspective, some of the challenges and value it can bring to existing market research. So let's crack on. So just in terms of an overview of what we're trying to cover today, first, we're trying to understand the crime scene. So really, what is behavioural economics? Why it's continuing to grow and some of its key insights as well. The second point is looking at the forensic analysis, so looking in a bit more detail at some of the evidence and counter evidence for this approach, and again, especially from a market research perspective. The third issue is looking at unreliable witnesses. So one of the biggest challenges from behavioural economics potentially to market research is it highlights the discrepancy between what people say they do and often what they actually do. So issues around self-report. So Samantha is going to touch on that, especially from a qualitative researcher's perspective. And then finally, we'll be interspersing evidence from practical examples and also point you towards some workable frameworks. So hopefully you can start to integrate this with your work. As with all good presentations, I'm going to try and start with an example, and it's going to be a little bit interactive, which is tricky considering I can't see you or hear you, but I'm going to ask you to imagine or use your imagination a little bit. So this is taken from a real world court case. So in 1994, a grandmother went into McDonald's in the States and bought a coffee. Then she went back to her car and actually tried to open the coffee while she was in the car with one hand. and those little fiddly lids that you have, she actually spilt the coffee on herself and burnt herself quite significantly. Now, this was in the States, which is a highly litigious society that we know and love. So she took McDonald's to court and they were actually found to be guilty. So McDonald's coffee was found to be kept a lot hotter than potentially necessary and more hot than other chain restaurants. So my question to you is just have a think about how much as a jury member you might award in damages to this lady. So to give you a bit more context, so the coffee cost 49 cents, the injuries sustained cost 11,000, the lady's initial claim was 20,000, and McDonald's countered with an $800 initial offer. So think a little bit about what you might give in terms of damages as a jury member. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about a sort of seminal research project in behavioural economics. This was conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are almost like the godfathers of behavioural economics in 1974. And this experiment had two phases. In the first phase, participants were asked to roll a wheel which had numbers from 1 to 100. And actually, although it was said to them it was randomized, it was actually set to either land on 10 or 65. So that was the first phase of the experiment. Then in the second phase, the participants were asked, is the percentage of African nations in the UN higher or lower than either 65 or 10, depending on the number that the wheel was landed on? That's a yes or no answer. Then we get our dependent variable from the second question. What's the percentage of African nations in the UN? And that was an open source question, so people could just respond and give an answer. So the results were, when the wheel landed on 10, the average guess of people was 25%. When the wheel landed on 65, the average guess was 45%. So the real question here is, why is it that this arbitrary number influenced people's guesses by up to 20%? And that's really an example of something called anchoring and adjustment, which is basically when people are unsure of an answer or placed under duress, they can be subconsciously influenced in terms of their judgment. So in this case, people anchored to either the number 10 or 65, and then adjusted their estimates from that. And this is really an example of a very robust finding in terms of the way that people make judgments, and it's called a heuristic, which is a mental rule of thumb or a mode in which people make decisions basically when they're under duress. So what bearing does that have? So going back to the court case, the actual award that was given in the end was $2.7 million. Now, this made a lot of news headlines. And how was this done? Well, the lawyer actually requested for damages of 2 days of coffee sales, then went on to say, each day McDonald's coffee generates $1.35 million in profit. So basically use that anchoring and adjustment heuristic to guide the jurors in terms of making that decision. And that is something that was looked at again in other research, looking at slightly the suggestibility of jurors. So there was a case that was presented where the information was the same across all participants, but the only variable was the amount that the lawyer suggested in damages. So the amount that the lawyer suggested in damages is on the left-hand side, so $100, 20,000, 5 million, or 1 billion, and then the influence on what people actually awarded. So you can actually see that the more people asked for, the more the jury actually awarded. So the more you ask for, the more you get. And this illustrates, as well as anchoring, also an important point about how information is presented and the importance of that in terms of how people make decisions. And that also can be referred to as sort of nudging in a sense. So anchoring and adjustment, or anchoring for short, is probably one of the most robust findings in behavioural economics, and that's applied across multiple real-world situations. For example, in charitable giving, I've worked with a UK-based charity on fundraising campaigns, where we looked at the campaign letter and also the campaign ask, which is often the little leaflet that you get in charity campaigns. And just by adjusting or using the anchoring principle in also the letter and the ask, so just adjusting two numbers, we increased the average charitable donation by 17%, whilst keeping the donation rate the same. Other areas where this is applied, often contemporary art. Damien Hirst is a master of this. His diamond encrusted skull, which was ostensibly on sale for £50 million or $50 million, was actually bought by his management company. And as a result of that sale, or that price tag, that actually increased the value of his own works of art substantially in the rest of the market. In finance, this is used all over the place. So minimal payments in credit card statements actually provide quite a strong anchor. So it actually means that people tend to pay off their credit cards slower. So without that minimum payment anchor in the bottom of your credit card payment, people would tend to pay more money. Property is quite an obvious one, both in terms of the negotiation and the property prices. And we work a lot around sort of retail and shopper insights. So looking at decoy pricing, so that having higher price items adjacent to lower price items, which is encouraging that sort of sale of those lower price items. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an indication of both the sort of power and durability of some of these what we call heuristics, which are mental rules of thumb. There are also heuristics and cognitive biases, which are also more sort of systematic biases in terms of the way that people make judgments and decisions. So anchoring, the one that's slightly highlighted in there, is one of multiple effects that have been proven and evidenced scientifically over a number of years. I think the real sort of trick to this approach is understanding these effects and understanding the context in which they operate, and really having a workable and efficient framework to manage and present these is quite important. The other thing to emphasize is that if you'd have asked people what influenced me in terms of making that decision, either about awarding the jury money or also about guessing the UN percentage, they wouldn't have said it was this arbitrary number that influenced me. A lot of these things are subconscious in terms of the way that their influence is there. And that touches a little bit on, I think, one of the challenges. So this difference between, you know, accessing the subconscious versus observable behavior. So I think I mentioned before, I do quite a lot of work around sort of eye tracking. So this is just a quick example. So we were working with a outdoor media company looking at applying a behavioural insights into campaigns to adjust their effectiveness and engagement. So eye tracking gives you a observable measure because it's a behaviour that's subconscious. So your eye movement is subconscious. So we did two things. We set people up with cameras in the street, but we also showed them a street view of Glasgow actually, and looked at some of the different outdoor media types. So I'm just going to show you a quick video. This isn't what they saw, because highlighted within there are some of the different outdoor media types. So here you've got some banners. There were also shop fronts. We were looking at the buses and bus campaigns, and you can actually see somebody's eye gaze as it moves around. Apologies, it's a little bit jumpy. But I think that gives you the principle that we would then code for fixations and whether people actually saw these elements. So we then combine that with traditional recall measures to sort of really differentiate when people said they saw something versus when they didn't see it. With our recall, I can't share with you the exact results, but I can share with you this. So we showed some elements which were in the scene, so this banner and the shop front, the new look shop front, versus the subway recall, which was not in the scene. So this is something that we do throughout our research, which really illustrates some of the time the difference between what people say they saw versus what they actually saw. So this bar graph on the right, these elements in blue were actually in the scene. So you can actually see that people recalled them fairly consistently, sort of 70 to 55%. These items in yellow were actually not in the scene. Apologies if you can see that. So you can actually see that the subway sign there was actually recalled by people 34% of the time, even though it wasn't present. So that sort of illustrates some of the issues that people encounter. And I suppose it also emphasizes the strength of using not just qualitative techniques or traditional market research techniques, but also contrasting that with observable techniques. Taking a step back, what is the evidence for behavioural economics? I think there's three main areas. The first is there's really been a growing and published evidence base. So in the US, well, actually, so basically, especially in the government sector or in the public sector, this has been taken up. So there've been large sample sizes where people have shown that, so the Behavioural Insights team, they publish a lot of information using large sample sizes, applying these techniques in the UK. So, for example, their mandate, which was set up in 2011, was to prove their worth. They worked under the Cabinet Office, was to deliver 10 times return on investment in their interventions on public policy. And they actually delivered that across multiple government departments. Last year, at the end of the year, President Obama introduced the Social and Behavioural Sciences team. And also last year, the World Bank issued a report which was on integrating these findings across policy and interventions. I'd say that's a real sort of step change in terms of public policy, which often used to be based on economic policy, so utility theory, the fact that people weigh up items, but now this is being integrated, basically looking at how people make decisions and make judgments in the real world as opposed to theoretically. There's a lot of ethical implications for that, which I won't get into. That's a long conversation, but happy to take it up offline. The graph on the right is probably the most overused graph in behavioural economics, but just shows the power of default. So this is the opt-in versus opt-out graph of countries in Western Europe and organ donation. So if you opt in to donate your organs, those are the countries in yellow, versus that means you have to make an active decision to donate your organs at death, versus opting out, you have to actually actively opt out to donate organs at death. And you can see there's not a marked, well, there's a marked difference in terms of behaviour, but I would say there isn't a marked difference in terms of attitude. So that just shows the power of default, and that's something that we've looked at in terms of looking at insurance companies as well. There's a plethora of awareness around this TED Talk. So that's Daniel Kahneman in the top left-hand corner. There's loads of them. There's also a huge amount of press coverage as well in the UK. Some of it linking it more with austerity measures, and it's got some negative press points, but I'd emphasize that the approach is actually politically neutral. It's just a process. It's just the way that the press has sometimes latched onto it. And then also there's a number of sort of books, both pop psychology, these are from a few years ago. I've highlighted Nudge and also Thinking Fast and Slow as probably the most well-known and the most popular. Increasingly well as well, I'd say, and this is important, there have been workable frameworks to sort of manage these insights and see how they can be applied in these contexts. So quickly, the one in the top left is Mindspace. That was written by the Institute of Government and was kind of the Bible for the Behavioural Insights team in this country for a while. That separates these effects into social, individual and environmental factors, and Mindspace is actually a mnemonic. So M stands for messenger effect, the N is around social norms and so on, and it's quite an easy framework to get your head round. That East is what the Behavioural Insights team has adopted to make it even more easy. So when they're talking about developing interventions, they're talking about making it easy, attractive, social and timely. Then in terms of looking at sort of habits, which is this in the top right hand corner, this is borrowed from sort of Charles Duhigg and also BJ Fogg. This is more interesting in terms of understanding people's habitual behavior and the fact that a cue prompts a routine and a reward, which is a almost like a virtuous sort of circle in terms of the way that operates. And that's interesting in terms of understanding both habitual shopping behavior and how you could potentially disrupt it, or also in the creation of habits. The behavioural change wheel in the bottom left-hand corner is really the kitchen sink in terms of this approach. It's very academic, it's very detailed, it's quite hard to read. It's been developed by Susan Meeke at UCL, largely in the health sector. But if you had a client that had, you know, £500,000, this would be a process that might be feasible. And then there are also multiple other cognitive models. Taking a step back again, just in terms of understanding it, I think there's a lot of confusion because there's a lot of terminology that goes around. I've used it already: behavioural economics, behavioural insight, behavioural science, behavioural psychology, nudging, decision science. And I think in general, when people talk about behavioural economics, they're actually using it in terms of an umbrella term to reference the entire set of disciplines, which not necessarily is correct, because actually it's the definition is a bit more narrow. So the study of cognitive, social and emotional influences on observable economic behaviour. So it's more to do with purely economic decision making. My own preference in terms of an umbrella term is around behavioural science, because I think that encapsulates this area, and there's a lot of overlap and shared knowledge from these different disciplines. But I think this encapsulates it quite nicely because it's talking about behaviour, so observed behaviour, but also a scientific approach to it. And I think, and I'll touch on this on the next slide, but actually probably the more accurate terminology is around behavioural insights, which is the application of those insights to research and interventions. So to sort of labour the point a little bit, but I think it's important because I think the area suffers a little bit from this, is being clear about what you're delivering and also what you're doing and what you're not doing. So I think the range really moves from the scientific methodology through quant towards qual, and just being clear about what you're employing at different points is important. So if you're employing a behavioural science method from a pure point of view, you're talking about an empirical method. So that involves sort of a priori hypothesis and significance testing. So yeah, strong statistics. It's often in controlled conditions, looking at one or two variables to limit the complexity. And there's often large sample sizes and often randomized controlled trials, which are really the sort of gold standard in behavioral science. So that's what people are using for medical trials as well. So as a result, these tend to be conducted by larger institutions, so sort of academia, governments, other big bodies, probably corporates as well, but those aren't published or shared. And the findings from these generate insights. And I think these insights is more where we as market researchers tend to be operating in terms of the understanding and the application of those. So with behavioural insights, I think there's more flexibility around the range of research methods and approaches, although there are still stats involved some of the time, and I think there's a bit more of a proactive element to it. So you can test concepts in research as well, but they also tend to have smaller budgets and smaller samples than pure behavioural science. They're often used to design services, products, or interventions in very complex environments, and they are run by a range of institutions. And that's, I'd also say that the application of these is much more linked to the marketing function. So some of the time selling this in, I found it quite hard to work out whether I approach the insight team or potentially the marketing team. And that at that point, I'm going to hand over because Samantha is going to talk a little bit more about the qualitative side of things.
So what I'm going to be talking about today is just following on from where Ian has really left off, but we're focusing more on the qualitative side of things and the impact, or how really behavioral economics can beef up our role as qualitative researchers, and how we can use it as a lens, an additional forensic tool within our toolkit as qualitative researchers. So qualitative research, we know, as a discipline, draws on many other disciplines, from psychology to anthropology to sociology, and increasingly behavioral economics. There's a huge impact that Behavioural Insights has had on the qualitative research and how we approach research and how we make use of these principles within our market research environment. So and why we structured it really around a CSI kind of framework today is because that's really what the role of qualitative researchers are. We're detectives in terms of behavior, and we approach a behavioral crime scene, and we're faced with real challenges in terms of deciphering, decontextualizing, and reconstructing that behavior understanding, so that we can make sense of what consumers say, what they do, and kind of the truth, or what happens in between. So for every behavior, for every attitude, for every perception, for every rationalization, there's an evidence trail. And it's our job as qualitative researchers and as skilled professionals to analyze these clues and to start to unearth the real motives and real passions. And it involves looking for all those hidden clues in what people say, distinguishing the truth from rationalization, and of course understanding their lives and their worldview, and just gaining a deep understanding of why they do the things they do. And of course that is to lead into what it means for business strategies, for potential positioning, for advertising platforms, and so on. But we are at a distinct disadvantage because we, like detectives, have a certain skill set, but we arrive at this behavioral crime scene after the behavior has taken place, and this presents us with real challenges. And some of the challenges we're going to talk about in terms from a qualitative research perspective is the way consumers really behave. So what Behavioural Insights has brought us is a deeper understanding of the irrationality, even if it is, as you know, to coin Dan Ariely, is sometimes predictable, that there is this irrationality around behavior, and how we get to grips with that as market researchers. Also the fact that we have limited access to the scene of the crime, that we are trying to piece this together after the fact, and what are the kinds of things that we need to consider, or how do we do that best. The fact that we deal with unreliable witness testimony, we know that consumers we are fundamentally inept at really understanding the deeper drivers and motivations of our own behavior. So we really are dealing with unreliable witness testimony, and the fact that context can change everything. And what we have tended to do as qualitative researchers is try to sanitize the human experience, try to sanitize human beings, either but within a rational, very sterile environment, or trying to get little slices of life without taking into consideration the complexities, the counterintuitivities, the irrationality of human behavior, and especially in the domain of decision making. So what Behavioural Insights teaches us, and we see from what Ian has put together, that these are some of the key crux issues around behavioural economics that feeds into the way that consumers really behave and has a fundamental impact on us as qualitative researchers. So the first is that we avoid cognitive load. Our brains have limited cognitive capacity. Thinking uses energy, and we try and take the easy route, and we use these heuristics, these mental shortcuts, to simplify decision making, to wade through the plethora of decisions and data that we are bombarded with every single day. The other thing that Behavioural Insights shows us is that preference is relative, and this is really, really important. Although most qualitative researchers will in any case advocate mixed methodological approaches, we need to understand that preference is a very fluid, very flexible thing when it comes to consumers. It's not absolute. There's social drivers, they're contextual inferences. So we need to bring all of those together when looking at consumer preference. The next is that we are not rational, that we are instinctive, impulsive, that we make fast, frugal, automatic, irrational decisions. And this challenges the very essence of standard utility economic decision-making models. It's not necessarily reward and maximization. It's about balancing priorities. In South Africa, we have a low LSM segment of consumer that, for instance, spends quite an inordinate amount of money every month to engage with satellite TV, but doesn't have running water at home. These are the kinds of almost counterintuitive, irrational decisions that people make when they are balancing different priorities within their life. And it's not rational. It's based on a whole lot of other things internally and contextually as well. We also switch between and this is where we'll touch on system 1 and 2. Most people that have had any kind of interaction with behavioral economics will know system 1 and system 2 thinking, and we just touch on that in terms of how this impacts qualitative research and how we approach a qualitative research process. We switch easily between this habitual and this automatic decision processes and these conscious and very effortful decision making, and that can lead to very, very different behavior. The social reality is that what we say and what we do are likely to be two different things. We don't always mean what we say, we don't always say what we mean, and we definitely don't always do what we say. What consumers have done in the past does not at all predict what they will do in the future, and that the way they react within one context or one environment has no propensity in terms of how they would react in another environment. So the big thing that behavioral economics brings to qualitative research is that behavior is king. And this fundamentally shifted how market researchers look at consumers and look at the research function, because traditionally it was all about attitude. So it's, well, you'd have to have an attitude or a perception or a feeling or a conscious understanding of a brand or of a product or of a thing to behave in a certain way. And what behavioral economics teaches us and shows us is it's not that rational, that often behavior can precede an attitude. We can behave in a certain way and then only develop the attitude, which is very powerful when looking at communication, positioning, advertising, and all sorts of other kind of more strategically focused studies. The other key thing is that behavioral economics is applicable to all different markets. We tend to think that this, behavioral economics, especially when you're going to more the behavioral science kind of space, can feel quite overwhelming, very scientific, and not that it might be applicable to different types of markets. But the principles of behavioral economics, the way that we make decisions and the way that and these heuristics and biases that we apply are applicable to illiterate, illiterate, evolved, unevolved, mature, rural, and even vulnerable markets. For instance, something like the authority bias, as Ian was talking about earlier, there's so many cognitive biases and heuristics at play. One, for instance, is the authority bias, which is very powerful in rural markets in Africa. And that is all around bias. It's about who you perceive to be the authority figure rather than who the actual authority is around a particular issue or has that knowledge. So all you know is all there is. Choices are made comparatively and not absolutely. And we ourselves and consumers out there incorrectly assume that our decisions are driven by thinking. And so we often want to rationalize and want to talk about the way how we think about what we do, but in fact it's often driven by feelings. So if we go into the system 1 and system 2 space, we see this is really the domain of system 1 is, in a nutshell, the automatic decision processes. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's instantaneous, and it governs most of our decisions every day. It just wades through all the clutter so easily and avoids that cognitive load. If we have a look at this picture, System 1 will immediately come into play. It's automatic, it's unconscious, and it tries to build a little bit of a story. So immediately certain context, certain thoughts, certain things will come to mind when looking at the picture. He looks angry, he's probably swearing. Depending on our own personal context, it could be a client. We could assume there's a client or colleague on the phone, he's an executive having a bad day. If we're busy going through a divorce, we could imagine that we immediately think that he is screaming at his wife. So there's two issues that come to play with System 1. The first is that it's immediate. The second, that it's prone to biases and systematic errors. And additionally, that it creates a context. If a context is not given, System 1 will create one. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and what impact that has on qualitative research. So some of the implications of System 1, I mean, one of a very good example is about thinking about any habitual behavior. If you have to start to think about how you did it or why you did it, which route you took to work, what you saw on the way to work, you'll find it quite difficult if it's a 45-minute drive to start to analyze everything, because you are in this very System 1, very habitual mode. And many of the decisions we do that way, and then we try and get consumers into an environment to tell us why and how that they did that. And all that we do is actually evoke System 2, which we'll talk about now. So some of the implications of System 1 is in packaging research. Often, you know, clients and would want steer on packaging changes or packaging designs, and they ignore the gut feel or the spontaneous System 1 response of consumers and tend to go more drill down onto specific design elements, specific interplay on packaging. And what they do is evoke far more rational responses, which are actually divorced from the way that consumers are making those decisions on shelf or making judgments around packaging. Another example of System 1 is really the bandwagon effect. And that's simply that people often do and believe things merely because many other people do and believe the same things. It's not, they will rationalize it in a whole lot of other ways, but it's simply climbing literally onto the proverbial bandwagon, and that individuals in a group can act together without any planned direction. So consumers will downplay this. Consumers like to feel that they're in the driver's seat of all the decisions that they make, that they have an internal locus of control, and that there isn't something as irrational, as instantaneous, as fast, and as frugal driving their decision making. So within the role of qualitative research, it becomes a question for us as those researchers and as those detectives to, in which scenarios do we actually want to engage System 1? Do we want those instantaneous responses? And what can we learn from that? What can it give to us? And in which case do we actually want to go into System 2, into more considered rational responses? So if we have a look at System 2, this is just an example of just a mathematical multiplication. So having a look at it, we know instantly it's multiplication, and we know that we can do it. We just need a little bit more time to do it, whether grabbing a calculator or using a pen or employing some method of working this out. And it's far more, it puts far more cognitive load on us. It's far more of a mental effort, and we don't access it as easily as we did just having a look at the visual that we looked at previously. And this is really the domain of System 2. So the questions for qualitative researchers is, how often is System 2 engaged? Is System 2, is that what I want right now? If we look at the considered purchases, big ticket items where people are really looking between different options, between policies, where they're trying to understand and make more System 2 decisions, then the whole entire line of questioning and the way that we approach that is totally different than the way consumers purchase yogurt, for instance. And then the question is, because we as qual researchers do have limited access to the scene of the crime, what we tend to do is want to piece everything together. And inevitably, we evoke System 2, and we get these kind of really rational responses that sound like the truth, but don't mirror what is happening in reality or what is really driving the decision-making process. So how the two systems answer a simple question, and we'll have a look at why this is important for ethnography and for multi-method approaches. So the question is, why do highly intelligent women marry less intelligent men? So what we see with System 1 is that we want to tell a good story. So she's compensating for intelligence, or he has other skills that she values more than intelligence. Try to create some kind of context or story around the question. Whereas if System 2 was engaged, then we would look at women and men born at the same average level of intelligence, look at things like IQ bell curves, look at regression to the mean, and say, well, there's no perfect correlation, so it's inevitable that you would marry up or down. But what we see is when we're posed with a question, especially a why question, that we try to construct a more compelling explanation than what could be the more rational response. So one of the examples of this I'll just quickly throw in there, because I'm just quite conscious of time, is things like purchasing yogurt. Consumers would tell us within lower LSM African markets, yogurt was never part of the palate. It's not really part of the climate, but increasingly it's become so. And within a more rational kind of questioning, moms will tell you it's about fat content, it's about lower sugar, this is what they look for, they drive for healthier options, they're looking for probiotics. When in fact, when we have a look at, when we do ethnography, when we do immersion, when we have a look at what they're selecting on shelf, then it's a whole complex dynamic of a guilty mom syndrome. These moms are entering the workplace, they're very guilty about the time they're not spending with their children, they want to give them something healthy-ish, seeing the category as quite generically healthy, but also give them something that's more treat. And we see what's driving them is cartoon packaging, stuff. The yogurts are full of colorants, full of preservatives. They're bright pink and red. They've got rainbow balls in them, but they will tell you that they are driven by nutrition and fat content and low sugar. It's about balancing these unreliable testimonies. And it's not that they're lying to you. This is really how they rationalize and how they believe it. But we need to, as researchers, look at all of these different aspects. So how do we corroborate this witness testimony? And this goes a lot towards overlaying different approaches, and also ethnography can be invaluable because we are natural storytellers and stories are about memorable events, but there is a lot of duration neglect, which is really, really normal. So it can be valuable when ethnography looks at the moment by moment and then it's overlaid with the story recall. So because what is expressed is not the same as what is actually happening, but how people rationalize their behavior, their attitudes, their perceptions to themselves and to each other is also a very valuable indicator of how they stylize themselves and how they create this world around them. And that's invaluable to begin to understand these complexities and these exaggerations and these omissions, which are all part of the human experience. So if we go to understanding why systems thinking is important, we have a look at, this is just a straightforward illusion that I'm sure everybody has seen, but what we're trying to show here is that not only is system one fast and frugal, so it sees these lines are not parallel, but even if we draw the parallel line there and we know rationally within system two that they are parallel, we feel that fighting of system one with system two because system one is very persistent. System two is rational and conscious, but it's lazy, and it wants to relegate the function to system one. It wants to give those decision making to system one. So that fighting, that feeling of rationality, that's part of this very natural, very powerful, and very intuitive drive of system one that drives a lot of our decision making and our impressions, and how we build those impressions. So what Behavioural Insights has also done is challenge the qualitative research approach of a kind of Freudian unconscious, which really postulated that it's a repository, it's recoverable, and that through projective techniques and through laddering, we're able to get into this unconscious and to really get into to why consumers do what they do. But what Behavioural Insights gives us is a more adaptive conscious, one which uses context, and if we don't give it a context, it will generate its own. So we'll have a look later at how that affects projective techniques and things like laddering. Context, as we said, context can change everything. So social interaction plays a very strong role in shaping the context of decision making, but this is ignored by consumers. So it's our job when piecing together that crime scene to understand context and to be very careful that we don't downplay the role of context, or you know, you can get great reactions to a piece of packaging which disappears on the shelf because we haven't looked at contextual factors and the contextual interplay of that packaging or how consumers make decisions at that shelf. But we must also be careful that we don't overweight context, because decisions made in a very cold context, one with low stimulus, reflective, more pensive state, are very different to decisions made in a warmer context, which are higher interaction and more upbeat. So we just cannot rely on claimed sentiment or pure preference. Sorry, it's skipping. So the problem we sit with is that these two systems are fundamentally at odds with each other. On the one side, we have this system one, which just effortlessly assesses all these impressions and feelings. And on the other side, we have system two, which is the conscious reasoning self. And this was the decides what to think and what to do. So it's important to understand, because if we start to try and separate these things too much, or we try to pay emphasis on one too much more than the other, outside of the context within which we research, we begin this process of sanitizing human beings, of trying to really just sanitize the human experience. And then we lose a lot of the complexity and the depth driving human behavior. So if we think of teaching teaching teenagers to drive, a study showed one of the most frustrating things for parents was teaching their teenagers clutch control, because they couldn't verbalize or explain how they were actually controlling that clutch on a manual transmission in terms of going forward. And that's what Kahneman postulates is our adaptive conscious, that these kind of, it's the architecture of our mind, that these everyday processes are relegated to the unconscious, and that becomes the realm of instant decision making. And it does not answer to why, and sometimes it doesn't even answer to how. So it's fundamentally different to the Freudian approach, which assumes this kind of store of primary infantile drives that can be accessed. And that becomes a question in terms of where do we focus projective techniques? In terms of this adaptive conscious, we have to be very, very clear and very astute and with how we use projective techniques. With laddering, ask the question, if we're laddered to why and to why and to why, at what point are we now not getting depth, but actually evoking system two? So if we have a look at this adaptive conscious, what it means for qualitative research. So what it means is that behavioral insights is not necessarily a tool that can only be employed to start to contextualize and understand human behavior. It is something that we can engage as a mindset, as a way of thinking from the inception of a research project. So understanding the heuristics in the approach and in the questionnaire design, things like the availability heuristic, that people are less confident in a choice when they're asked to produce or recall more arguments to support it. The best example of that is when a woman was asked if they were assertive, if they believe they are assertive. And the decision as to whether they were assertive or not depended on how many incidents they could recall where they felt they had been assertive. So in terms of questionnaire design, it can really skew or create internal bias if certain heuristics are not taken into consideration. Gut reaction is important, and sometimes gut reaction is all that you need before you start going into a rationalized space, obviously depending on the nature of the research project, but that's focusing on the fact that system one might not be, or it is not, rational, but it is a very fundamental daily driver of many of our behaviors. Again, talking to laddering, that laddering just assumes a recoverable state. In fact, we're dealing with this adapter. So we have to be very astute and careful and skilled in terms of using laddering techniques. And the fact that rotation is important. There's no neutral choice. Understand how we set up the research design, whether we are actually creating forms and frameworks for choice architecture and forcing or nudging and not actually allowing intuitive consumer decisions. And one of the big challenges that Behavioural Insights brings to qualitative research is that traditional qualitative research asks why. So if system one doesn't answer to why, should we be asking consumers why at all? And that is a whole entire other debate. So there's a whole wealth of information and discussions and debates and seminars around what is the function of traditional qualitative research and what is the function of asking why. And generally the consensus seems to be among most that why qualis are motivational researchers. So asking why is still at the heart of what we do, but it needs to be done with prudence, that why has limitations. We need to understand those limitations and the potentials for being misleading, so that the answers may make sense, they may be somewhat true, but it's fundamentally unreliable. And we know that it's coming from system 2 because people don't have access often to the actual reasons behind the feelings, innermost attitudes, and judgment. So we've all watched the reaction of stimulus. We've watched consumers get highly excited, get really positive, and watched this kind of wane to become, to become quite as pensive, to almost doubt, to rejection. So it has led to fundamental debates about the role of the focus group, for instance, but that is an entirely different debate. So I think I'm just really conscious of time. So just to try and wrap up a little bit, and we'll work really quickly through this. And we can also, address this in the Q&A section. So what we did was looked at, if we're looking at this qualitative research space as almost a crime scene, and qualitative researchers being detectives that have to piece together and get to the heart of this behavior, then we know, first of all, we know each crime scene is different and they require a different approach. But this was taken from the FBI crime scene forensics, and this was the kind of practical tips in terms of approaching and dissecting a scene, and those were the kinds of steps. So if we had a look from a qualitative research process, we see that behavioural insights, behavioural understanding can be utilised in all of these phases. So even from inception, from proposal writing, from interrogating the brief, kind of understanding the context, what are the BE biases or heuristics that could be at play? How do we do that in terms of how we position and formulating discussion guides? Are we wanting to go more indirect or more direct questioning? What are systems, what responses are we hoping to evoke from that? How do we close the door on logical rationalizing? How do we get those more instinctive responses? Which are the kinds of indirect methods we should be using for projective techniques to access this more adaptive conscious? In terms of examining the evidence, and what are the kind of cultural, social, individual nuances, the social context? Can we add ethnographic, online, face-to-face, social, friendships? What are all those kinds of things at play? And then there's, sorry, I'm going to finish up here because we are running out of time, but in terms of photographing and sketching is around using behavioral economics to map consumer in landscapes. So the internal and external drivers, values, lifestyles, impact on choices. So you can incorporate behavioral economics as a way of thinking in terms of modeling that scene and creating aspects of psychographic segmentation or semiotics or even inferential triangulation. This also helps with current and future propensity mapping, because the challenge is that what consumers say they're going to do is not necessarily what they're going to do, and what they've done in the past is no prediction of what they'll do in the future. So what this also helps do is create more realistic mapping, future mapping in terms of propensity in behavior. But it's not a silver bullet. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's just positioned as another form of insight, as well as another tool within our arsenal as qualitative researchers that we can employ and that we can draw on to contextualize and to understand the human experience. It works very well when it's complementary to other research approaches. So when you still focus on kind of triangulation methodologies, it provides another lens, and it focuses on complexity, and that's and reducing those complexities to simple understandings of judgment and experience. So it really just gives us inspiring opportunities to stretch beyond our traditional use and allow clients to make strategic decisions based on these forensic biopsies of behavior. It's another tool, and it's an effective tool through which researchers are able to gain sufficient consumer understanding. And then from there, we can construct relevant, effective, and most importantly, actionable strategy and direction. And I think we've run out of time. At this stage, Ian, as far as I understand, Ian and I will be open for questions. I've
got a question here from Paul Hutchins. Hi, Paul. And he says, given that heuristic influence operates at a subconscious level, where do you draw the ethical line in deciding which clients to help and how? Wow, that's a big question. So, who wants to take that one? Ian, why don't you take it? You've been quiet for a while.
Thank you. That is a biggie. So that is a big question. So I won't work with certain clients, tobacco, a few others. That's my own sort of ethical decision. And in terms of where you draw the line, my read on this is slightly controversial, I would say, but I'll try and be brief about it. I think that instinctive marketers are actually quite adept at understanding their markets and applying various insights to their product or various other things. I think behavioural economics, although powerful in terms of adding incremental sales or things like that, sometimes, I mean, it's not the only technique. And I think it can add advantage, but I sort of cachet it in the sense that there are multiple other tools out there. So I don't think I've actually answered that question. But there are certain clients that I won't work with, and I know for a fact that some of the larger clients who are spending huge amounts of money researching on this are keeping it very under their hat. And I think there are ethical questions about that, and I'm not going to try and address it now, but I'd love to pick up with that and maybe do it over a beer, because yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. Okay, Alan Bowman. Hi, Alan. What do the team believe are the principal biases at play? And he says when it comes to household waste and recycling, but generally when you're working with these, we all know about the cognitive biases. So what would you say are the principal biases at play? But from Alan's context, it's to do with household waste and recycling. Samantha, do you want to try that one?
Yes, I can. Sorry, my sound is not so good at the moment. So the question is around what are the kinds of typical biases at play?
Yeah, but in the context of waste and recycling. But I think just talk to us about just the principal biases that you tend to come across anyway using behavioural economics in a research context.
Yes, I think that's also very dependent on the market and on the category. So the biases are almost there's a whole lot of different ones, and there's ones that are more prevalent in different categories or in different markets. For instance, in our market, the social proof heuristic, availability heuristic, bandwagon effect, that we come across a lot. So it's more about understanding these different cognitive biases, understanding where they what they're all about, and then within the scope of your research, being able to identify that behavior might be driven by that, and being able to support your findings with those biases. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
I think that's great.
I think I'd add in there very quickly. There's something there about a sort of an almost immediacy bias. See, there's an issue around the fact that some of the impacts of climate change are seen in the long term, and they're not necessarily framed in the immediate term, and that's not necessarily salient when people are making decisions about recycling. And as Samantha said, there's things there about habit change and also social norms as well, but there's a lot of different effects in there as well.
Okay, yes, we are running over time. If I can ask my audience to stay for a couple of minutes. There is a few questions that have been asked of a similar nature, and I'll blend them together if I can. Fiona Silver says, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities for market research from behavioural economics? For example, do you think behavioural economics will push market research towards observation-based techniques? Kevin McLean says, how in practical terms has the way you do qual research changed compared to 10 years ago? And how receptive, and this is from Penny May, how receptive and aware are you finding clients to be? You touched on marketing perhaps being more receptive than insight teams. What are the main barriers, or aren't there any? So this is really a question about how market research and behavioural economics are working together, the extent to which clients are accepting of behavioural economics. So maybe Samantha first. What's your view?
Okay, in terms of it actually just moving to observation-based kind of research, that we're not seeing in our market. What we're seeing is emphasis on including observation, immersion, and ethnographic fields as a standard overlay to more traditional qualitative research methods. Having said that, we're not in the kind of online space that other markets are globally. So online is still very small here, and it's still rely fundamentally on traditional research, but that is because our market is still very fundamentally socially driven. So you need to understand those dynamics. In terms of going forward, there will always be, and that is an entire different debate, which I'm really happy to take offline, but there will always be a space for the kind of more traditional focus group environment, because there is real value in how consumers rationalize. This is a part of their experience. This is also a part of who they are. But what behavioral economics has done is brought the emphasis on how they actually behave, how decision making actually. So when we come to the client point of view, clients are, they have the so what mindset. So they're very open to kind of thinking and talking about behavioral economics, and that's all great to know, but they want to see how it can affect strategy. And they're more interested in what they can do with the findings. So we're finding the role of behavioral economics is actually beefing up understanding and strategic results from qualitative research, which can then be used in strategic decision making. So our clients, I'm not sure, Ian can probably speak
Ian,
to a different level.
Final word from you, Ian, on this whole issue.
Okay, so I'm going to start with how receptive clients are, and I'd say that's variable. Some are extremely receptive. Some people are aware of this literature, and I think there is a sort of appetite for it, but there's a bit of confusion about how to apply it and how you can apply it some of the time with limited budgets. So I think people are receptive to this approach, and linked with that, there's probably it's an easier sell to start to talk about observational research. I would always position it as a complementary form, because I think it can add incremental insight, but qualitative research or more traditional quantitative research adds different lenses into it. So I wouldn't overpromise it ever. Part of the challenge is there's appetite there, but if you're actually applying sort of behavioral science or behavioral economics properly, you're actually, it's slightly different than traditional research in the sense that you'd be some of the time trying to identify and then apply these insights in certain concepts. So it goes from a pure market research environment to something where you're testing some of these concepts, and actually getting that traction internally is very hard. And that's also linked with who you end up talking to. So there might be a limit. People might just say, well, we just want a report generated. But actually, the insight and the interesting bit is actually when you apply it and test different iterations in the field where you're applying some of these insights. And that's quite hard to get budget for and traction with, which is why trying to marry up the insight and the marketing teams, which is almost impossible, but trying to do that is a step that sort of I try and make, but I don't get a lot of traction with it.
Okay, well, thanks both of you. Really fantastic presentation.